Welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star, and this is our second class out of our 7-part series on astrological magic. If you're watching this on YouTube, I do recommend that you watch them in order. So you might want to go and check out the first class. If you're attending live here and didn't see the first class in the series, I think you'll be fine. You'll definitely want to watch that before our next class. The first two classes are a little bit independent, but then we'll be kind of really combining together what we did last week with what we do this week in our, not last week, last class. I always say that. What we did last class, what we do this class, will be combined together for our third class. All right, so last class, we talked about the hexagram, we talked about the symbolism of the hexagram, and then we built up and learned how to perform the lesser ritual of the hexagram. And so that ritual will really be the foundation for all of the magical work that we're gonna do in this class series. So learning that, continue practicing it, and learning that and having that pretty ingrained is definitely important for everything else like going forward. And when we're talking about the symbolism of the hexagram, of course, the hexagram is a 6-sided figure, so we connected it primarily, to the number 6. But we also talked about how we can formulate the center of the hexagram as a 7th point, and then as connected to the 7, or to the heptad, the sacred 7, that we could also connect it to the 7 classical planets. And so, we just mentioned that last time, although we did see how the hexagram was especially connected to the sun and to the solar principle. And that might be a nice thing to keep in the back of your mind as we go through the material today. But what we're going to do today is focus on the 7 planets and on their meanings and significances. As I said last class, Temple of the Silver Star takes no official position about what form of astrology people practice. Either its members or takes no official position on which forms are correct or better or anything like that. It's entirely individual. I practice tropical astrology, and the sort of style that I've been working with has been really a fusion of modern astrology with ideas drawn from the tradition, like from Hellenistic astrology and even from medieval and Renaissance astrology as well. So that's my personal take. I'll try to present things that I think are pretty generally applicable, to the entire tradition, but I'm definitely working from that perspective, and I encourage you to be skeptical and to make up your own mind about any of these things, or to disagree with me about anything that I say about these things. But yeah. All right, so before we get into the main material, I just wanted to make a couple of notes about a couple of the ways that we can approach astrology and think about it and think about its significance. In a couple of weeks, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the philosophical issues around astrology, like how astrology actually works, and issues about like fate and free will, or whether the planets are causes of events or signifiers of events and things like that. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few weeks. But for now, I just wanted to present kind of the astrology, and the psyche, and the idea of the psychological, and also the idea of the soul. We generally translate the word psyche as mind. Right, but the Greek word psyche can equally be translated as soul. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. So yeah, just a couple of notes here to preface what we're going to do today. We can make a distinction between inner what I sort of calling inner astrology and outer astrology. Inner astrology tends to be, like in modern terms, it's called like psychological astrology, and modern astrology really focuses on this inner aspect of it, of looking at astrology to talk about the nature of like the individual personality, and even doing things like timing techniques like transits and other sorts of things. It's about describing like subjective experience, right? And so it's focused on inner experience and the inner nature. Whereas in traditional astrology, there's more of a focus on outer events of saying, like, will my business be successful? Will I get married? Will my marriage be happy? More like concrete and sort of outer things, or will something happen? Will good things happen to me or bad things happen to me? Those types of questions tend to be more outer. And I think that there's no need to choose between those two things. We can really do both. We can look at the chart from both perspectives. And I think following along with the Hermetic idea of, as above, so below, which I like to also paraphrase as within, so without. I think that's another way of thinking about that idea of above and below. And that the below is the reflection of the above, but the above is also the reflection of the below. That the two are interdependent and connected, and sort of mutual reflections of each other. And same with inner and outer. So we can, I think, really both perspectives and understanding that profound relationship between the inner and outer is a really nice way of approaching astrology and saying that, of course, it speaks to both the inner and the outer because those things are not independent of each other. Another way, of talking about that idea of sort of inner and outer, psychological versus more concrete, and also, talking about magic and archetypal symbolism and esoteric symbolism, and then talking about concrete life events. We can also talk about linking the mundane and the magical. Recognizing not just the signatures or natures of the planets in our own inner natures, in our own psyches, our own spiritual work, and our own spiritual progress, but in the world around us, in things that happen to us, or maybe even in the news, and astrology and the cycles of astrology and all that can really speak to the events both around you personally and within you as well as in the greater world. And I think that helps to link, the mundane and the magical. I think is a really beautiful aspect of the study of astrology. And I also wanted to, I was reading recently James Hillman's really interesting book, Revisioning Psychology. And in that book, he talks about the idea of what he calls the polytheistic psyche. Excuse me. He talks about this idea of the polytheistic psyche, that our psyches, which, and he really goes into a lot of detail about how, psyche should be understood as soul and not just as as mind in the materialist modern sense, but that the psyche is represented, or is best represented and thought of as containing a multiplicity of forces that may contain, may contradict each other or even oppose each other at times. That thinking about the individual self as a kind of multiplicity is very useful, though it's not a pure multiplicity. Although in our sort of manifest or more concrete actions, there are these sort of multiple forces and multiple powers, and sacred powers too. I mean, it's polytheistic, right? Not necessarily religious, but of sacred and divine powers that are within us, but also understanding that all of those things are, in a sense, all different mouthpieces or expressions for soul or for unity. And I thought that was an interesting way of approaching, last week, or last class, we talked about the formula of Arorita, right? This sevenfold formula that expresses the unity, right? And so that seven in the Arorita, the 7 letters that make up the name, and the 7 words in the full phrase, it's obviously connected to the 7 planets. And so we had this idea of unity within multiplicity, or a multiplicity that is also a unity in I think a mysterious and profound way. And I was also thinking about if any of you watched or attended the series that I did on the Sephiroth I think it was the 2nd class in that series. We talked about Pythagorean or sort of Neoplatonic arithmology. And we saw there that where the 1 or the monad is associated with Zeus, the 7 or the heptad is associated with Athena, and the symbolism there is that Athena, springs directly from the forehead of Zeus, and so the 7 was said to spring directly from the monad. Now, for the Pythagoreans, they didn't consider the number 1 to be either odd or even. 2 was the first even number, and then 3 was the first odd number in their way of thinking. And so the odd and the even, as they kind of code as male and female, can be like mother and father. And so where the number 4 is 2 squared or 2 plus 2, 5 is 2 plus 3, 6 is 2 times 3. 8 is 2 cubed, 2 to the 3rd, and then 9 is 3 squared, or 3 to the 2nd, and then the 10 is kind of like the completion, or we're return to the beginning. The 10 is complex for its own reasons, but the 7 isn't produced by the 2 and the 3. It's a prime number, and you can't, right. So the 7 has neither mother nor father and springs directly from the monad. And so this is another really interesting numerological way of connecting the heptad, the 7, to the monad. All right, and then in Hillman's book here, he quotes from a classical German scholar, Walter F. Otto. I'm not particularly familiar with Otto or his work, but I thought it was a great quote, so I wanted to share it here. So Otto says, there is no such thing as personification, only a depersonification. Just as there is no mythologizing in the authentic sense, only a demythologizing. So-called abstract concepts and words would never have been raised into the personal had they not been from the beginning personal, that is, divine forms. So in talking about the planets today, as you'll see, I'm going to really talk about these in sort of personal terms. I think of the planets as persons, as living, intelligent, spiritual powers, as celestial powers and even divine powers. So my approach to these things is in this personifying, but not in personifying just as a tool, but understood, as Otto is talking about it as something that has sort of been true from the beginning. But in the modern world, we've tended to depersonify and demythologize things that are sort of inherently personified. So again, just a way of thinking about the way that I'm going to relate to these things today. Though of course, we encourage you to find your own approach and to be skeptical and all of that, of course. All right, so we're talking about the 7 planets, the 7 classical planets today. Now, 2 of these, the sun and the moon, we don't call them planets in the modern sense, of course, but this word planets comes from a couple of Greek phrases here. We have, oh, weird, it changed my font. I converted this to PDF. The E's with the accent look funny there. Anyways. So we have, and apologies, I have absolutely no Greek whatsoever, but something like planetes, asteres, the wandering stars, or simply the planetae, the wanderers, are both used to refer to the 7 visible, what we call the 5 visible planets, as well as the sun and the moon. For our terms, in the terminology we're going to use here, we're going to call these the planets. But again, this idea of them as the wandering stars or as the wanderers, opposed to the fixed stars that, of course, we know that they do wander very slowly, but nothing like with the planets, the speed at which the planets move. Right. All right, so to start with just a little astronomy here. This is something we'll come back to a couple times throughout the series here. We have the model of the solar system here, with the sun at the center, and the orbits surrounding that, the orbits of Mercury, Venus, then the Earth, then Mars, and then we have the asteroid belt here that separates the inner planets from the outer planets. And then we have Jupiter, and then Saturn. Saturn is the furthest out of the planets that you can visibly see, that you can see with the naked eye. Mostly, there are a few recorded sightings of Uranus, but it's not visible enough for anyone to identify it or to have named it or anything like that before the invention of the telescope. So then we have Uranus and Neptune, which are also outer planets and gas giants, though they're not part of the classical scheme. And as I said last week, I use Uranus and Neptune as well as Pluto in my personal astrology, but they're not directly relevant to the magical tradition that we're going to be talking about. You can't invoke them with hexagram rituals, so we're not going to worry about them. But I think they can absolutely be included, though they tend to be to speak more to generations and world events and things like that. And now, other than Pluto, which is a very strange planet, and really, of course, in modern terms, I don't consider Pluto a planet at all, but one of the Kuiper Belt objects, though different than a lot of the other Kuiper Belt objects, in that it actually crosses within the orbit of Neptune occasionally, which is an argument for why it's still valid to use it in astrology. But the other planets all lie more or less along a flat plane. I'm not going to explain it here, but there's some fairly simple mechanical explanations for why the material in the early solar system was distributed along a plane surrounding the sun. Right, but so that plane, from our point of view, is what forms the ecliptic. So that plane that you saw on the last slide, that's what the blue circle is there. That's the plane of the solar system. But our axis, the Earth's, the pole that runs from the North Pole to the South Pole is inclined to that axis. So the ecliptic is angled to our equator at 23.5 degrees. So this ecliptic here, the ecliptic is defined by the sun's apparent movement throughout the course of a year. And we can see that it's divided into quarters by the solstices and the equinoxes. And then, in the tropical way of doing the zodiac, each of those quarters is then further divided into 3 equal pieces to get the 12 signs of the zodiac. We'll talk about that more going forward, but I just wanted to get the idea of the ecliptic and the idea of why it is that the planets all move around this ecliptic. Not always exactly, as we'll see, some of them can move above or below to a certain extent, especially the moon. But this is like the track around which the wanderers do their wandering. All right, so here you have the planets to scale with the sun. So you can obviously so how much larger and more massive the sun is than the other planets, right? Obviously that's the sun here, and then we have Jupiter and Saturn, as well as Uranus and Neptune, and then those four tiny little dots are Mercury, Venus, the Earth, and Mars, the four inner planets. All right, and then again, now without the sun, so that you can see the scale a little better, we have the planets to scale by size. So we have the planet Mercury, and then the planet Venus, and then Earth, and then Mars. You can see these are fairly small rocky bodies. And then the two classical outer planets, Jupiter and Saturn, are thousands of times larger than the Earth, and they're very, very different in composition. They're not hard, rocky bodies. They are gas giants. All right, and then at the bottom there we have the planets to scale by distance, right? So we can see the inner planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, they're fairly close together and fairly close to the sun. Then we have the asteroid belt here, which separates the inner from the outer planets. And then we have Jupiter here, and then again Saturn there. And going beyond, there's all, it's not exactly logarithmic, but almost this like increasing like doubling of distance. You know, as Saturn is basically as far from Jupiter as Jupiter is from the sun, and then Neptune is like is as far from the sun or Neptune is as far from Saturn as Saturn is from the sun, approximately. So there's like this increasing in scale as you go out. All right, so now we'll return to this later, so we're not going to go through all of this here in detail. And I'm providing it, I'll provide the slides for you all if you want this for your reference. But we've got the 7 classical planets here arranged in what we can call ascending Chaldean order. Normally Chaldean order goes from Saturn like down to the moon, which is from the slowest to the fastest, but here we're going from the fastest to the slowest, or from the nearest to the furthest. All right, so the moon is the fastest and the closest to Earth. She orbits the Earth in about 27.3 days, which means that she goes through the entire zodiac every 27.3 days. And so that means her speed varies a little bit because of the ellipticity of her orbit, but she changes signs about every 2.3 days. Now, she has a synodic period, which is also a solar phase period. This is her like phase relation with the sun from our perspective. And so this is the cycle of waxing and waning. So there's 29.5 days from each new moon to the next new moon. And you'll see that that period is a little bit longer than her orbital period because, well, if you think of, like, so a couple weeks ago, we had a new moon in Aquarius. It was at, I think it was like 23 Aquarius. The sun and moon were conjoined at 23 Aquarius. That was the new moon. So it'll take the moon 27.3 days to go all the way around the zodiac and come back to 23 Aquarius. But that won't be a new moon because the sun will have moved into late Pisces by that point. So she'll have to go a little bit extra to catch up to the sun and for there to be another new moon. So the new moons, she has to go a little bit more than all the way around. And the moon has no retrograde period. Like I said, her speed varies a little bit, but it's more stable and never retrogrades. Now, Mercury orbits the sun in only 88 days, but it takes Mercury approximately an entire year to go through all 12 signs of the zodiac from our perspective, because Mercury is never more than 28 degrees from the sun from our perspective. So you can think of like Mercury and Venus from our perspective are almost like tethered to the sun. They race ahead of the sun and then stop and turn around and come back and then stop and go forward again. So they sort of move back and forth in front of or behind the sun, but are never that distant from it. Now, Mercury has a synodic period of 116 days. So Mercury goes retrograde the center of each Mercury retrograde is 116 days apart, approximately. And when Mercury does go retrograde, he is retrograde for 3 weeks. So you get 3, or because that 116 doesn't evenly divide 365, you get 3 or sometimes 4 Mercury retrogrades per year. And we'll talk about the significance of retrograde in some of our following classes. Venus is a little bit slower. She orbits the sun in 225 days. She's never more than 47 degrees from the Earth. And she goes retrograde once every about a year and a half. And she's retrograde for 41 days, approximately. Now, the sun, of course, the sun's motion is really the sun's, our motion, the sun's apparent motion is defined by the Earth's orbit around the sun. And that literally just defines our year. And that's 365.24 of our days. All the days here I'm using Earth days, not the individual planets' days. This is all Earth days and Earth years. And so the sun changes signs once every month, approximately around the 20th of every month. That varies a little bit. Our months are uneven length, and there's the issue of leap years and all that. The sun, of course, has no solar phase because that's the relationship of a planet to the sun. So the sun doesn't have a solar phase of its own and is never retrograde. The delineation for a retrograde sun, I think, is imminent apocalypse, right? All right, and then Mars. So Mars takes about 687 days, a little less than 2 years to go around the sun. Now, Mars at his fastest changes signs about every 6 weeks or so, about every month and a half. But around his retrograde periods, he's much slower and can stay in one sign for up to 6 months near his retrograde. And this actually happened just last year. Mars entered Aries at the very end of June of 2020, and then had his whole retrograde in Aries, and then didn't actually leave Aries until January 6th. And so he was retrograde for a little bit more than 6 months, all in that sign. But that's unusual, and only happens about every 2 years. All right, and then Jupiter and Saturn are much slower, because they're much further out. So Jupiter takes 12 years to go around the zodiac and to orbit the sun. So Jupiter changes signs once every year, approximately. Sometimes his retrograde cycle makes that more complex. He just entered Aquarius back at the end of December, and he will briefly enter Pisces in May, but then he'll retrograde back into Aquarius by July, and then remain in Aquarius until the end of 2021. All right, and then Saturn takes about 30 years to go around the sun, which means that Saturn changes signs of the zodiac approximately every 2.5 years. Again, slightly complicated because of retrogrades. He can leave a sign and then come back in again. And now with Jupiter and Saturn, because they're so much slower than the sun, their synodic period is really the sun going around and catching up to them. So both of their synodic periods are just a little bit longer than our year, and they're both retrograde for about a third of the year. And like I said, we'll come back to that later. But I just wanted to introduce you to that idea because it is helpful. Thinking about the motions and the speeds and all that is helpful for building up some of their core meanings and significances. I saw a couple of people typing. Yeah, feel free to jump in with questions at any time. All right, so now I want to break down the planets into some different categories and look at some of their relationships to each other. That's a really helpful way of starting to build up their significances and their meanings. So we're going to categorize them in a handful of different ways here on the next few slides. All right, so the first way we can break them down is we have the luminaries or the lights, which are the sun and moon, which are very obviously different than the other 5 of the wanderers. The other 5 can be very easily mistaken, just for other stars. Venus is much brighter and so is maybe more obviously a planet, but the others are very easily mistaken for planets. But the sun and moon are obviously, they're big, very, very bright orbs in our sky and are obviously very different. So they're called the lights or the luminaries for very obvious reasons. All right, and then the other 5, we're going to break them down here into 2 categories. We have the inner planets, which in astrology is sometimes referred to as the relating triad. And so the idea here with Mercury, Venus, and Mars is that these are more personal and tend to talk about personal things and about the way that we relate to other people on a kind of individual basis. The way we communicate, Mercury, the way we communicate with people, Venus, the way we have, relationships and form relationships. And then Mars, the way that sometimes we experience strife with people, or we compete with them, or don't get along with them. And then we have the classical outer planets. Again, Neptune and Uranus are also outer planets, but we're just focusing on the classical ones here. So we have the classical outer planets, or what we would call gas giants, which again are much slower and much larger and much further out. And so they tend to talk about the relation of they tend to be bigger in scale. So Jupiter and Saturn, they can be more abstract, less personal, and to talk less about relationship of one person to another or one being to another. It doesn't necessarily have to do with other humans, of course, but more of the individual in relationship to the environment or to society. And so it tends to talk about things on this larger scale. And then again, Neptune and Uranus take that sort of progression even further and have even less, where Jupiter and Saturn are the relationship of the individual to the bigger scale. Uranus and Neptune often tend to talk about that larger perspective more directly. Um, but again, we won't really be talking about Uranus and Neptune here. I was just, yeah. All right, so here's another way of breaking them down. So now we have, again, the luminaries, the sun and the moon. But now this is a traditional way of categorizing the planets. And yeah, I'll talk about this more in the next slide as well. But we can talk about Venus and Jupiter. This is sort of breaking them down by function. You know, on the last slide, we were breaking them down by their scale. This is more about what they do in the chart and how they operate. So Jupiter and Venus are called the benefics, the planets that tend to be easier and more like subjectively desirable and to be sort of helpful and supportive, whereas Mars and Saturn are the malefics, the planets that bring challenges and difficulties. And then Mercury doesn't fit into any of these categories. And as we'll see, there's going to be a very definite pattern of Mercury not fitting into categories, which is a lot about the nature of Mercury. All right, so let's talk about benefic and malefic here. First, we can also divide the benefics and malefics into the lesser and greater. So we see that Venus is the lesser benefic, and Mars is the lesser malefic, and then Jupiter is the greater benefic, and Saturn is the greater malefic. And so the words of lesser and greater, I think we can really think of that in terms of like the scale that they're, the lesser planets here are on a more intimate, more personal and smaller scale, and then the greater are on a bigger scale. We can also think of them in terms of speed, like transits from Venus and Mars are much faster, and so they tend to be a little bit, not exactly surface, but not as deep and profound and long-lasting as the slower planets. So Jupiter and Saturn, in their cycles, tend to talk about like bigger and more fundamental and slower changes, whereas Venus and Mars are a little closer to the surface and are faster. And that's another way we can think about speed. The moon is so fast that her transits and things like that often just talk about moods or the way that like parts of your day will go. If I notice when the moon hits like certain points in my chart, I'll just sort of have a bad morning or something like that, right? It's not big, life changes. It's just like I'm in a bad mood for a few hours, or I'm in a good mood for a few hours or something like that, right? So that's another way that speed, we can think about speed and how that changes the way the planets operate. All right, but with this category of benefic and malefic here, first of all, they're not good or bad or something like that, and they're absolutely not moral. There's nothing like good or evil here or anything like that at all, and it is very subjective. All four of these things are absolutely necessary. They are necessary, important, and sacred, aspects of human life and of the cosmos and all of that, but Venus and Jupiter tend to be more like subjectively desirable, and they tend to bring, things that we like and that we want and that generally support. Whereas the malefics tend to indicate like challenges or obstacles or difficulties. Another way of thinking about this too is that the benefics tend to say yes to things, and the malefics tend to say no to things. So the benefics tend to like confirm, where the malefics deny or negate. And I think if you think about this for a minute, it's obvious that being able to say yes to things and being able to say no to things are both important. If you only ever say yes to things, that probably won't work out very well. Deciding the things that you don't want to do or the things that you don't want in your life are just as important as deciding the things that you do want in your life. And, without challenges and without obstacles, we would never, human life just sort of wouldn't be anything like the way that it is. Challenges and obstacles and difficulties are so much a part of human life. And without, a lot of different, mystical and religious traditions, of course, have observed this, that without strife, there would be no sense in talking about harmony. Without war and conflict, there'd be no sense in talking about peace. Without fear and frightening things, there would be no possibility for courage. Without injustice, there would be no possibility for justice. So in order to talk about justice, we have to also have injustice. And our astrological system should reflect that there's both justice and injustice in the world. And as we'll see, this is just a sort of basic orientation of these planets. In particular charts, Venus and Jupiter are certainly capable of causing problems, and Mars and Saturn can do really good and important things and be really helpful and beneficial. This is just a very basic orientation that will be modified by a lot of other factors. And then finally, I have a quote here from 17th century herbalist Nicholas Culpeper, who I really enjoy. He's very witty and entertaining to read. So he's an herbalist, but he's also an astrologer, and he thinks about this classical herbalism, thinking about herbs in terms of like planetary signatures, as well as thinking about health in terms of planets and things as well. So diagnosing health problems or difficulties, in terms of like planetary signatures, and then using that knowledge of herbs to treat those things. He's roughly a contemporary of William Lilly, if you know who Lilly is. So around that Elizabethan astrological era. Anyways, so Culpeper says, he's talking about the plant wormwood here, which he attributes to Mars. And then he says, why should men cry out so much upon Mars for an unfortunate? Unfortunate is like an Elizabethan term for malefic. Why should men cry out so much upon Mars for an unfortunate, or Saturn either? Did God make creatures to do the creation and mischief? So he's obviously phrasing this in like monotheistic terms, but we don't need to. The idea that that these things, the infortunes or the malefics, are necessary, important parts of the creation, right? And then he says, the truth is, Mars loves no cowards, nor Saturn fools, nor I neither. So I don't know, this is amusing and is a nice, I think, attitude to take towards this issue. All right, now we have another really important concept in traditional astrology, and this is called sect, which we can think of sect as like team or like faction or whatever. So we have the day sect and the night sect, or the diurnal and the nocturnal sect. So like the day team and the night team. All right, so the day team is the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn, and the night team is the Moon, Venus, and Mars. And so this is important for their symbolism, but it's also important for delineating and for reading charts. And we'll see that more on the next slide. I think it'll be easier to look at. And now we have another example here of Mercury not fitting into either category. Mercury is either part of neither sect, or you can join one or the other depending on various factors, though that's not extremely important. And there's actually like a lot of variation in the tradition about how exactly you decide whether Mercury joins the day sect or the night's, or the night sect. And so not only are we dividing the planets into day and night, but we're also going to divide astrological charts into day and night, depending on whether it's day or night, right? And so the day is when the sun is above the horizon, and the night is when the sun is below the horizon, which you can easily see by looking at an astrological chart. The line drawn from the ascendant to the descendant, that's the horizon. So the sun is above that, it's daytime. If it's below that, it's nighttime. So charts can be divided into day and night. And so your birth chart is either a day chart or a night chart, depending on where you're born. And so I'll just move on to the next slide here. So each sect has a luminary, a benefic, and a malefic. And then, Mercury, again, just doesn't fit into any of these categories. So now what happens with the luminaries is that the luminary of the sect tends to be more characteristic. And so, in modern astrology, people really focus on sun sign. When people say like, I'm a Taurus, they mean I have like sun in Taurus, right? But for traditional astrology, that importance would be given to the luminary of the sect. So that is the sun if you're born during the day, but it's the moon if you're born during the night. So this is a nice way, if you're familiar with some modern astrological concepts, to test out. This is one of the things that really kind of grabbed me when I first saw some of the stuff in traditional astrology, was looking at my own chart from the perspective of sect. It made a lot of sense. I'm born by night, and I definitely identify more with my my moon sign than with my sun sign. Of course, traditional astrology also really emphasizes the ascendant and the planet ruling the ascendant, but we'll get to that later. But you might think, if you are born at night, whether it makes sense, that, or whether, you can maybe identify more with your moon sign than with your sun sign. Again, all this stuff can be modified. There's lots of other factors, that we would need to take into account. But this is a kind of, all things being equal, people born during the day will tend to identify more with their sun sign will tend to characterize them more, whereas people born during the night, their moon sign will tend to characterize them more. All right, and so now we also have the benefics and malefics divided by, we have a day benefic and a day malefic, and then a night benefic and a night malefic. And so what happens here is that the planets that are of the sect, that match the sect of the chart, those you tend to get more of the like positive, helpful, beneficial significations of those planets. And the planets that are against the sect, or what we call it contrary to the sect, you tend to get some of the more difficult aspects or the more difficult significations associated with those planets. So what will happen is if you're born during the day, because Jupiter is a benefic and matches the sect, Jupiter will tend to be the most positive and the most beneficial area in your chart. And wherever Jupiter is located and the area of life that that's associated with will tend to be the easiest parts of your life, or the parts of your life that you see some of the greatest benefits coming through. Again, all this can be modified by other factors, but this is a kind of general way of looking at it. And then Venus, although Venus is also a benefic because she's contrary to the sect, you'll get maybe a little bit more of the more difficult aspect of Venus, or just not quite as beneficial. And then with the malefics, because Saturn is a malefic, but Saturn is, if you're born during the day, Saturn is of the sect in favor, you'll tend to get more of the constructive, helpful sides of Saturn and less of the difficult sides of Saturn. But Mars, which is a malefic and is contrary to the sect, will tend to be the most difficult point in your chart. So this is another thing you could, and then for the night, it'll be like exactly the reverse. For people born at night, Venus will tend to be the most positive part of your chart, and Saturn will tend to be the most difficult part of your chart. Again, those are just general tendencies, but that can be a really nice thing to look at, and especially when delineating a chart, you look at the luminary of the sect, look at the and so the luminary, will tend to characterize the person or the event or whatever it is that you're looking at, and then the benefic that matches the sect will tend to be the most positive or beneficial area of the life and of that chart. And then the malefic that's contrary to the sect will tend to be the place that you have the most difficulties and the places that you tend to struggle, which is a really helpful and important thing to be able to identify, right? Is where our struggles are and what the kind of kind of archetypal and symbolic signatures of our struggles are. Kelly's asking if this tracks with sidereal reading as well as tropical. In the Indian tradition, which it's interesting, the Indian astrology, at least the kind of sort of main line of it, there's a number of different Indian astrological traditions, but the more common, well-known ones are actually much closer in a way to like Hellenistic astrology than they are to like modern astrology. And so the Indians, use this idea of sect and everything. Not always in exactly the same ways, but they do sidereal and they use these concepts as well. If you're doing Western sidereal, I don't know, it's something you could experiment with, but Western sidereal astrology is very different than like Western tropical astrology, and it's also very much from like a modern point of view. So. It's something you could experiment with, but certainly, these concepts exist, have been in the Indian tradition for, a couple thousand years and are still used today. All right, let's just keep moving on here. All right, so now traditionally the planets are also given genders. This is interesting. I think that it's really not, I don't consider the idea of gender at all. I think that the elements and the distinction between like day and night and other things can do everything that the delineation of gender was supposed to do, or the importance of like assigning genders to planets and then genders to like the signs of the zodiac and looking at if that matches or not. So I don't employ this like practically. The one thing that does come up for me is in talking about the planets in this like personal way that I've been talking about, I do use like personal pronouns to talk about the planets. So, for the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn, I use masculine pronouns, and for Venus and the Moon, I use feminine pronouns. And I've been trying to get in the habit of using like singular they for Mercury. Mercury was traditionally called hermaphrodite, though I think the idea is better conveyed in modern parlance by like the term non-binary. Mercury is sort of neither male nor female, or is both or either in different senses. So I think, in modern parlance, non-binary is the best way of describing this. Or liquid is a good way. But also of sort of containing contraries or being outside of just sort of not fitting into categories is a very mercurial thing. Now, in most of the older traditions, Saturn is generally considered male, and there's still some open kind of questions that historians are looking into about an alternative tradition of treating Saturn as female. which would be much more symmetrical and balanced and nice for a lot of ways. But again, I don't think that it's actually important for practical delineation. So there you go. I just figured I'd mention that, but yeah, I'm not going to apply it at all in the process of actually like reading charts. All right, so then before we get into looking at the individual planets, one of the ways that a lot of the significations of the planets get developed and built up is by looking at them in terms of like dyads or pairs of opposites. Now, this is just one way that you can pair them off into opposites. We'll see, I think, at least two more as we go through the series. So this is just one way to sort of help us get started with significations of the planets, is by dividing into these pairs of contraries. So the first one we have here is the two luminaries, the sun and the moon. You know, they're the same, and they also have things in common. Like there's things that bring these pairs together and make them reasons that it's helpful to think of them as pairs, right, or as dyads. You know, the sun and moon are the same apparent size in the sky. You know, they're the two luminaries, the two big luminous orbs. You know, they light the world by day and by night, and they can also that light on a more sort of metaphorical or symbolic level is like the light of consciousness or the light of vitality. All right, and so then I have a bunch of pairs of opposites here to help build up some of these ideas. So the sun is light and the moon is dark. Although the moon is a luminary, she also can talk about darkness, which is a sort of interesting double signification that the moon has. So the sun is light and the moon is dark. The sun is constant, the moon is variable. The sun is emanation, the moon is reception. The sun is reason, the moon is sensation. In Kabbalistic terms, you know, we can associate the sun with the ruach and the moon with the nefesh. The sun is like waking, the moon is dreaming. The sun is more public, you know, more extroverted, more outer, and the moon is more private, more inner or more introverted. Yeah. And then also, you'll see the idea of the sun and moon as like father and mother, and as something you could read in a birth chart. Like the position of the sun might tell you something about your father, and the moon about your mother. But I think it's useful to hold those ideas lightly, especially as people, you know, awaken to you know, the reality of non-traditional families and all that. You know, whether that's being raised by someone other than your biological mother and father, or, you know, a single parent, or, you know, like a same-sex, you know, couple, you know, who adopt a child or give birth to a child or whatever. I think it's useful for holding that idea lightly, and also to realize that in some, you know, families, the father might play more, the male parent might play more of a lunar role, and the mother might play more of a solar role. So I think it's a helpful signification, but, you know, we can be kind of open and flexible and aware of that. So I invite you to you know, to just sort of hold those ideas a little bit lightly. All right, then next we have Venus and Mars. So Venus and Mars are the lesser benefic and the lesser malefic. And as we talked about, they're inner planets, they're personal, they're more concrete, and they're the two nearest orbits to our orbits, right? Venus is one orbit in and Mars is one orbit out. So where Venus is harmony, Mars is strife. Venus is grace, Mars is power. And again, these words are just words that I came up with, you know, based on my own studies and all of that, of course. There's lots of other things that you can use. I'm just trying to give you some indications. You know, Venus is grace, Mars is power, Venus is appreciating, Mars is striving, Venus is attraction, Mars is repulsion, Venus is beauty, Mars is strength, Venus is cooperation, Mars is competition, Venus is connection, and Mars is separation. And so hopefully you can see there too that it's not like all of Venus's significations are good and Mars are bad. I mean, you can see why Mars would be, you know, more prone to difficulties and things like that, but it's certainly not bad. All right, and then we have Jupiter and Saturn, the greater benefic and the greater malefic. They're the slowest, largest, and most distant planets, as we've been talking about. They're the gas giants, and like we said, they're broader and more abstract and a little less personal than Mars and Venus. So Jupiter is optimism, Saturn is pessimism. Jupiter is expansion, Saturn is contraction. Jupiter is freedom, Saturn is limitation. Jupiter is abundance, Saturn is austerity. Jupiter is faith, Saturn is doubt. Jupiter is growth, Saturn is harvest. Jupiter is hope, and Saturn is realism, or being realistic about things. All right, and then Mercury. Now, Mercury can be paired with other planets, and we'll see that, you know, as an opposite with some of the others. But in this particular scheme, Mercury stands by themselves. So Mercury is multiple and non-binary, and Mercury contains contraries, right? So it's not Unlike the other planets, which are to a pair of planets which are contraries, Mercury contains contraries within themselves. So Mercury is mutable, shape-shifting, and adapting. And Mercury, talks a lot about boundaries, both like tracing and creating boundaries, as well as crossing boundaries. And if you're familiar with like the Herms from the Greek tradition, those like boundary markers, that's a really nice, I think, symbolic, kind of archetypal like reference point. All right, and then Mercury, as we'll see more when we talk about a little bit about the god Mercury and Hermes. Mercury is the traveler between worlds who moves like from one category to another and isn't like restricted by categories. All right. Oh, right. So last thing before we get into the individual planets here. We can talk about temperament. I talked about this in a little bit more detail in the series that I did on elemental magic and pentagram rituals. So you could check that out if you're interested in hearing me talk about this a little bit more. But we have the 4 temperaments of sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, and melancholic. And each one is a combination of 2 qualities. So we have 2 axes of hot and cold. Again, I talked about this in more detail in that other series, knowing that I was going to be doing this series and I wanted to spend more time with that there. So broadly, hot and cold are very kind of active and more passive or receptive. Hot is like jumping right into situations, being kind of like direct and sort of enthusiastic or like engaging. And then cold is maybe like having more distance. Or observing, right, is a more like cold way of and again, as I talked about in the elemental series, a lot of this is just like in our language. We talk about like people having hot takes on things like on whatever, Twitter or something, right? Or if someone's being a bit cold, right, we still talk in that terms. Or even cool, like if somebody's cool, they're very like unperturbed. Being enthusiastic is not very cool, right? All right, and then wet and dry. Wet tends to be like fertile and uniting and productive, whereas dry tends to be separating. And it can be infertile, but also clear, right? The wet can get things can get very sort of soggy and hazy, and it can be difficult to distinguish between, like reality and fantasy. Everything can get really sort of messy and confusing, whereas dry can be very clear and distinct. Right. So again, extremes in one direction or the other can be problematic, and the ideal is balance. All right. So the planets can also be categorized this way. This is just a kind of rough graph to give you some indications here. So one thing you'll notice is that the malefics, Saturn and Mars, tend to extremes. So Mars is extremely hot and extremely dry, and Saturn is extremely cold and extremely dry. And I was thinking about this stuff in terms of like different like landscapes or environments. So if we think about like extremely dry landscapes, we might think about deserts, right? The desert is a harsh environment, and it can be like extremely, if you think of like Death Valley down in Southern California, you can be extremely like dangerously hot during the day and then dangerously cold, just 12 hours later. And so although the desert is a harsh and dangerous environment, I love the desert. The desert is really beautiful and a wonderful place. You just have to be careful. You have to make sure that you won't get overexposed during the day, that you won't become too cold by night, that you have plenty of water. And I was thinking about like a sanguine environment, like a hot, wet environment. It would be like a jungle. And so jungles are very like conducive to life. They can also be very dangerous because of how full of life they are. Jungles are full of all sorts of funguses and bacteria and predators and poisonous and venomous things. So again, not good or bad, just sort of like harsher and less conducive to life, or more conducive to life. But there's a lot to be said about that. The sort of the emptiness and the quiet of the desert, of course. All right, so then the benefics of Jupiter and Venus, they tend to be more mild, and they're also wet. So Jupiter is sort of mildly sanguine. Venus is definitely wet, usually considered cool, though there's some traditions that say that like when she rises as a morning star, she actually becomes somewhat warm, but generally cool and wet. The moon is also cold and wet generally, and the sun is warm and dry, though not extreme like Saturn. And then Mercury is very variable and can be found sort of all over the graph, but tends towards dry because the dry has that idea of separation, and Mercury talks a lot about like the separation into categories. All right, so let's keep moving along here, and we'll talk about each one of the planets individually now that we've built up some of the structure and talked a little bit about the relationships and interrelationships of the planets. All right, so starting off with some kind of astronomical and observational stuff about the sun. The Greek name for the sun is Helios, which is literally just the Greek word for sun. To the naked eye, as you all know, the sun is a blinding brilliance, fills the sky with light, and also hides the other planets and stars. And we'll talk about that more actually in the coming weeks. This is actually part of the significations of the sun, is that when the sun is around, you can't see anything else. And if a planet is very close to the sun, on the ecliptic, it's not visible at all. Like Venus right now is very close to the sun, and so you can't see her at all, not by night or by day. She needs to separate from the sun before she'll be visible, and that won't happen for another couple of months. So that idea of the sun being so bright as to obscure other things is part of the traditional signification of the sun. All right, in astronomical terms, the sun is the gravitational center of the solar system and contains 99.8% of the mass in the solar system is the sun. As we talked about, the Earth's orbit around the sun defines our year. The apparent annual motion of the sun around the Earth, again, apparent, defines the ecliptic. So the sun can't deviate from the ecliptic because the sun literally defines what the ecliptic is. All right, and then the Earth's motion relative to the sun, or Earth's rotation relative to the sun defines the day, right? So day and night is defined as, whether we're facing towards or away from the sun. All right, there's a lot of really, really interesting stuff about the actual composition of the sun, but just a couple of facts here. The core of the sun is 15 million degrees Celsius, and all that heat and energy is being produced by nuclear fusion. And so the sun fuses 6 million metric tons of hydrogen into helium nuclei every second. Which is just a mind-boggling number, right? And outputs 3.86 times 10 to the 26 joules per second. Now, a joule is a very small, unit of energy, but 10 to the 26 is an enormous number. And even in kilowatt hours per second, you're still talking about 20 orders of magnitude, which is just an unimaginable amount of energy. All right, and then it's important that the sun is the only significant source of light in the solar system. The light of the moon and in the light of the other planets, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, all the other planets, that light is reflected sunlight. That's an important part of the sun's symbolism as well. And again, we might think about that fact about the hexagram, the sun being at the center of the hexagram, and the hexagram being especially associated with the sun as the one, of course, the very hot things like in the core of planets or magma or whatever can give off light. But, for all practical purposes, the sun is the only true source of light in the solar system. All right, so just real quick, and we'll come back to this in our next class, a little bit about the deities and the mythology associated with the planets. So for the sun and also for the moon, we'll have two different figures. First, we have Helios, or in Roman, Sol, who is a titan rather than a god, and really more directly is the sun, right? Like Helios is the sun. Helios is depicted as you can see in the image there, as driving a chariot pulled by 4 horses, often depicted as winged horses, which draw him across the sky, throughout the day. And you can see the little figures there are like the figures of the planets who are diving into the ocean at the approach of the sun. So again, that idea that the sun obscures and sort of blots out everything else by his brightness. There's not a lot of there's some things, but not a ton of mythology about Helios. And again, Helios is more directly the sun and is a titan rather than a god. Now, the main god in the Greco-Roman tradition associated with the sun is Apollo, but Apollo is not the sun, right? Apollo could be described as a solar god, but he isn't the sun in the way that Helios is. In that statue you see there of Apollo, originally he was carrying a bow. Originally, Apollo was an archer. The bow is broken over time. Constantine just pointing out that they made all the horses male. You're correct. I hadn't noticed that. Yes. Well, and Helios is male, so I suppose that makes sense. Anyways, right. So Apollo is depicted as an archer, and it's believed here that this version of Apollo was probably the Pythian Apollo. So this is Apollo slaying the python, the chthonic serpent that dwells at Delphi. So Apollo, again, we'll see. We'll see more about archery in a moment, but that idea of like firing rays, like the sun firing rays of light, is some of that archery kind of symbolism there. And we can think about Apollo as the god of reason, also the god of music, and music, especially in the ancient tradition, is really associated with mathematics, and with harmony and with ratio and proportion, and sort of clarity and definiteness, all very Apollonian. And yeah, again, all those ideas about reason and the human mind, all that stuff is associated with Apollo. Again, there's a lot more, and we'll come back to this more later on. All right, now let's look at the astrological significations of the sun. In a way, the sun is the simplest of the planets. To understand, the others get a little more complex. So the sun is the luminary of the day, and his glyph, that you can see there, is shows a center and a circumference. The sun's metal is gold, for its reflective qualities. And if you've ever seen like a building or an outdoor statue or something like that, like actually reflecting sunlight, gold can be like incredibly luminous and almost like blinding to look at if it's directly reflecting sunlight. So gold is absolutely the metal of the sun. All right, now, as we said, the sun's temperament is sort of mildly choleric, so warm and dry, but not extremely so. All right, and then for each one of the planets, I'm just going to give you a whole bunch of keywords. You can sort of take them as they seem useful to you. And again, with all of these things, we're talking about archetypes and about celestial powers that can never quite be captured by like human logic and reason. So we're always kind of circulating around archetypes or trying to like triangulate things that we can't quite approach directly. So, take all of these things in that spirit of trying to like describe the outlines of something that's difficult to or impossible to quite get at directly. All right, so a bunch of words for the sun here. We have light, spirit, intelligence. Now, intelligence here, as a lot of astrologers have pointed out, is not like IQ or something like that. It's more about the function of the mind and the mind's like consciousness and the ability to direct consciousness towards something and to see it and comprehend it and understand it. We're not talking about just like ability to do math problems or something like that. That's more like Mercury. All right, yeah, vision, vitality, the personal identity and the ego are very solar. Also, the individual will, not like the true will in the Thelemic tradition, although individual will is probably not unrelated. And so the sun or the position of the sun in a chart might give you some helpful clues towards the true will, but it's not the true will, directly. It's something a little more closer to the, to the ego and to the personality, though also not unrelated. Also things like warmth, center, the executive function, although the planets are all sort of equals and, well, more or less, different planets can be more or less powerful in different charts. The sun does tend to have that executive function of directing. And things like purpose is another good word for the sun. The sun is invigorating, rational, clear, constant, steady, active, bright, distinct, noble, and cheerful. Sun can signify certainty, authenticity, right? Being authentic or right, being like sort of true to yourself is a very solar thing. When people say, oh, someone's worried about doing something or whatever, and someone says, oh, just be yourself, just go out there and be yourself. That's extremely solar advice, right? The sun, in symbolism there, like you can see in the image on the right there, the sun is being depicted there as a king. So the sun is often associated with sovereigns and monarchs, and especially kings. But we can also think of the idea of like self-sovereignty, the idea of autonomy and of ruling and directing your own life. So autonomy, sovereignty, independence, the idea of being like the monarch of your own life and the own existence is a very solar way of thinking. The sun can also signify like public affairs and, again, more extroverted or outer things. The sun can signify leadership, performance, and self-expression. Performing on a stage is, again, an extremely solar thing to do. Giving a lecture, or acting in a play, or doing a musical performance, sort of being on stage and being that like center of attention. That's all very solar sort of activities. The sun signifies like directing energy, shining light, vivifying, illuminating. And again, that's both like true in our lives and in the world, as well as in astrological charts. The sun can sort of vivify and illuminate other planets within the chart. Also, radiating, shining. And then I was thinking of this recently, that if you say that someone is self-centered, that's generally taken as a criticism, as something negative. But if you were to say that someone is centered in themselves, that would seem like, oh, the person is sort of enlightened or something like that, right? But they literally mean the same thing. And I thought that was interesting, that both, we talk about like the healthy and unhealthy expressions of any particular planet, whereas being self-centered, of being like needing to be the center of attention and only thinking about yourself all the time, that could be more like an unhealthy expression of the solar function, whereas just being sort of centered within the self and like radiating your own inner light into the world, that's more like a healthy expression of the sun. All right, and then moving on to the moon here. Let's see. So the moon, in her Greek name is Selene, which again just is the Greek word for moon. Again, I'm sure you all know what the moon looks like, but just building up some of our symbolism here, the moon is a shining white orb who waxes and wanes, right? The moon is only that full orb, for a couple days each month when she's full. So she sometimes lights the earth by night. The sun always lights up the earth by day, but sometimes the moon is dark and is invisible. And so that waxing and waning of the moon, that variability, is part of her symbolism. So she's the Earth's satellite and the closest body to us. She's by far the fastest planet. Even Mercury at its fastest is only about a sixth of the speed of the moon, so she moves extremely fast compared to the other planets. And as we'll talk about a little bit at the very end of this class, her orbit is inclined to the ecliptic by 5 degrees, meaning that she can really deviate from the ecliptic. She can come above or below it. And we'll talk about that with eclipses. That's important. All right, and her synodic cycle, or her solar phase cycle, is the origin of the month. And it's actually right in the word. That mon in month is the same as moon. It's a Germanic root meaning moon. All right, and so for divine figures here, we have, again, a Titan, Selene, or Luna in Latin, who most directly is the moon. And you can see her here in this statue. She has the lunar crescent on top of her head there, and she has this sort of billowing shroud around her. I was unable to find exactly what that symbolism was intended to be, but I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about, so often the moon appears, if there's some moisture in the air, the moon appears with like a shroud or a kind of ring of light or something like that around her. So I was thinking that might be what's being depicted there. And you can also see here that this is a torch that she's carrying. And a torch, of course, is something that shines light in the darkness. And so the moon, again, has that both light and darkness, right? And so the moon is where the sun just sort of shines so much light and there is no darkness in a sense. The moon is like a light within darkness. So I think that's significant. And then we also have the Greek deity Artemis, or in Latin, Diana. And Artemis is the twin sister of Apollo, and she's also an archer, right? So we have both the sun and the moon, firing arrows or like beams of light, right? Artemis is interesting, often depicted as a virginal maiden, very often solitary. She's often, like in the Homeric hymn to Artemis, you'll see her talked a lot about it as like hunting wild beasts by night. And so that idea of the wildness, although she's at once like a virginal maiden, there's also something very kind of like wild and almost like savage about her. And certainly the moon speaks to like the animality and the animal or like almost like bestial nature of things. All right, so now some astrological significations of the moon. So the moon is the luminary of the night. Her glyph is uncomplicated, it's just a crescent moon, and her metal is silver. And we think of the quality of moonlight, it's very silvery in quality, that sort of gray but radiant light. Her temperament is generally phlegmatic, so cold and wet, but it varies with the cycle. At certain points in her cycle, she always tends towards the phlegmatic, but she can heat up and or dry out at different places in her cycle. The moon represents or can represent the body mind. So we could oppose that to like the solar spirit. The moon is like kind of like the vehicle for the spirit and the thing that incarnates it and gives it the ability to function and to interface and relate. So Crowley uses this really nice word to talk about the moon as sensorium. The sensorium is like the organ of perception, or like almost like the faculty of perception, that which allows us to perceive and to receive information. Other lunar words here, we have intuition, instincts, needs, feeling, emotion, attachments, domesticity, comfort. The moon is associated with creation and with like bringing things into the world. The moon is associated with the womb, right? The place where we like incubate things and then give birth, either literally or metaphorically. The moon is associated with manifestation as the closest body to the earth. There's this Hermetic and also Gnostic idea of like the soul descending through the planetary spheres on its way to incarnation on Earth. And the moon as like the last or closest of the planetary spheres is what finally like clothes the spirit with body and gives like definite, concrete manifestation. And again, that can be more or less literal. The moon is like the source and ground of life. And the moon is also mysterious, where the sun is very like clear and distinct and direct. The moon is more diffuse, more mysterious, and has a kind of depth that I think the sun does not have. So the moon is sensitive, delicate, soft, easily influenced, and we'll see that in the charts. The moon very easily takes on and is very influenced by the planets that she's closely configured to. They really influence her. Both the moon and Mercury can be very variable. The way I like to think about the difference, though, is that Mercury is more like a shapeshifter who can take on all these different forms, whereas the moon is like a container that can be filled up with different things. Somehow that just makes a lot of sense to me. So the moon is easily influenced by the other planets and can really give body and manifestation to the other planets. So she can kind of effectively strengthen the other planets by giving their rays or their significations like body and manifestation and concrete form. But again, with the waxing and waning, she's also fluctuating and can be restless. So people who are very characterized by the moon can be kind of restless, or Crowley talks about lunar people having wanderlust, right, and needing to move around or like change professions a lot. And I certainly identify with that as a fairly lunar person myself. All right, the moon can also signify impermanence, and we can contrast this with the idea of that solar autonomy and sovereignty. That's certainly like a great and important thing, but it's not the whole story. We're never truly independent. You won't live very long, and you won't have a very interesting life just sort of floating off in space all by yourself, right? We rely on not just other people, but all other beings, ecosystems, the planet, and we're connected to and interdependent with all those other things. We have specific parents. We are the products in many ways of karma and of things that exist outside and before us. So there's impermanence, interdependence, and the sense of participating in life, right? The moon is both like taking in nutrients, digesting it, and then excreting them again, as our own participations in that interdependent like cycles of life. And even thinking about the physical body, our physical body is made up of components, extracted from, things, other living things. And after we die or after, we excrete waste products, those things are broken down and reused and recycled into new organic forms. The moon also signifies things like nurturing, caring, receiving, reflecting, contemplating. Again, reflecting can be like reflecting the light of something else, but also reflecting like an inner reflection on things, or like digesting information. That's all very lunar as well. Reflecting, contemplating, relating, responding, and again, that idea of forming, giving form or body to things. So let's see. Kelly said in Jane Wolfe's diaries, she talked about the sun and moon coming today, and she was talking about having sex with a man. Oh, coming together. I see. Coming together. Right. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And the union of the sun and moon are very often depicted in those sort of sexual terms. Sorry. Um, Oh, sorry. My live audience of one here was noting that I had missed another comment. Oh, from Kelly. Kelly saying that it's also associated with menses. Yeah, and actually, I just saw very recently there was actually a study came out that showed that actually like statistically verified the synchronization of the menstrual cycle with the lunar cycle, which I think people have actually known for a very long time, but statistical science has finally actually like caught up with it. There's also statistical evidence for the moon being linked to sleep cycles too, which again I think people have known for a very long time. But it's nice to see some the sort of mainstream scientific community coming around to those ideas. Oh, right. But I was going to say, especially in like alchemical symbolism, you'll often see images of like the king and queen, representing the solar and lunar powers, united in having sexual union. Right. So sex is both a metaphor for like an alchemical process, and those alchemical or astrological things can also be like metaphors for sex. We're not reducing one to the other, but there certainly is that interrelationship. Yeah. All right, and then the moon, especially in more like traditional astrology, really takes on some different significations depending on whether she's in her waxing half of her cycle or the waning half of her cycle. So waxing, we can talk about the moon is filling with light, and we have significations of like accumulation, warming, growth, generation, increase, beginning, and planting, like planting seeds. Like herbalism and traditional like farming almanacs and things like that. You plant seeds during a waxing moon. The waxing moon does shade a little. The luminaries really aren't benefic or malefic. They have a different function than that. But the waxing moon may tend to shade more towards benefic. And then the waning moon is like the pouring out light or spending or expenditure, cooling, also things like decay, dissolution, decrease, and ending, again, as part of that process. And then also harvesting, where you plant seeds during a waxing moon, you harvest during a waning moon. And the waning moon may shade a little bit towards the malefic. All right. Let's see. So next, Mercury, and we got to keep moving here. We may go a little bit over, unfortunately, again, but I'll try to move a little bit quickly here. All right, so Mercury in Greek was called, again, apologies for the Greek pronunciation, Mercury was called Stilbon, which means the twinkling one. It's interesting to note that the Greeks didn't call the planet Hermes. They referred to the planet as like the star of Hermes, so they recognized it as like being of Hermes or like belonging to Hermes, but they didn't directly identify it with Hermes. And that is important. That the mythology is helpful, but we shouldn't over rely on it because, like the god Mercury is male, but Hermes, the planet is like non-binary or hermaphrodite. So there are differences. All right, so appearance to the naked eye. Mercury is very often invisible. Mercury spends a lot of time so close to the sun that they cannot be seen. Fairly dim star, a little bit brighter than Saturn, but one of the dimmer of the seven. And is only because it can't separate from the sun very much, is only ever seen either just before dawn or just before sunset. So very elusive and often invisible. The Mercury has the most variable speed. At their fastest, they're only slower than the moon. But Mercury makes the most frequent retrogrades, so very often like changing speeds, stopping, reversing, stopping, turning around again. So that sort of sense of darting back and forth and being extremely variable is important for Mercury. Closest planet to the sun, and often to other planets. If Venus and Mars's orbits are closer to our orbit, but at any given moment, if you say what planet is actually just like closest to the Earth, about 45% of the time that's Mercury. And then I think it's like 35% of the time it's Venus, and then the remaining, whatever, about 20% or so, it's Mars. And that's true of other planets as well. And that's because Mercury is so close to the center of the orbits. So it's a nice kind of messenger sort of thing, is that Mercury is like the closest to all of the planets. I think that works really well. Also, Mercury is mostly really just the core of a planet that may have been worn away by bombardment in the early solar system. So it's interesting to think of Mercury as being like a planetary core. Yeah, Mercury also has a couple of interesting anomalies. I won't spend much time on it here, but Mercury has a stronger magnetic field than it really should. And that's still kind of an unanswered question in astronomy, is what exactly produces the Mercury's magnetic field. And also, interestingly, Mercury, again, has this idea of like not following rules. And we see this in the idea that like in Newtonian classical mechanics, really perfectly predicts the orbits of all the other planets. But Mercury deviates a little bit, something called I won't explain what it is, but the precession of the perihelion of Mercury. It has to do with the ellipticity of Mercury's orbit. That ellipse itself like slowly orbits around the sun, but orbits a little bit slower than like classical mechanics predicted it should. And so there's actually a theory for a while that there was like another planet that was like out of phase with the Earth, and so we could never see it, that was disturbing Mercury's orbit. But it's actually time, this was a nice confirmation of general relativity. It's actually time dilation because of Mercury being so close to the sun and the strength of the sun's gravitational field. The precession of Mercury's perihelion is actually slowed down by time dilation. There are two images of Mercury here. The upper image is more like naturalistic. And if you were to like fly over Mercury, this is what you would see is the upper image. Though you'll often see this like color enhanced version of Mercury, which represents real colors, but is like a composite of many different photographs and is really strongly color enhanced. But I often see it getting like passed around as an image of what Mercury actually looks like. So I like this idea that Mercury would sort of present himself as being like far more bright and colorful than he really is. Somehow that fits really nicely with Mercury. And in tradition, especially like traditional astrology, Mercury is very often associated with being like multicolored or having a lot of different colors together is associated with Mercury. All right, just a couple words about the god Hermes or the Roman Mercury, the messenger of the gods. Although messenger of the gods, associated with swiftness and speed. Although he's, one of the Olympians, he also journeys into the underworld. And on the right there in that painting, you can see Mercury or Hermes in his function as the guide of souls. So Mercury has this function of crossing between the worlds, of moving from Olympus, down to our world, and then down to the underworld and coming back again. So of moving frequently, crossing borders, being a messenger and a herald. And that the caduceus, the staff that Mercury carries there, is based on the herald's or the messenger's staff. And that staff was carried by, like if you had a warring armies or something like that, the messenger carrying that staff would be, like allowed into the enemy territory for negotiations and then allowed to leave again. So that's some of that idea of Mercury being able to like cross into like enemy territory and then come back out again and having that unique function and not being harmed and able to deliver a message, and to parlay with the other general or whatever. Again, there's a lot of really great stuff in Hermes mythology, and we'll see some of that again in our next class. All right, astrological significations of Mercury. Again, as we've been talking about, Mercury is beyond categories or moves between them. Mercury's glyph is the caduceus, or is based on the caduceus. Mercury's metal is mercury, which is also known as quicksilver. And quick there means like living or like vivified. So it's like living silver. And is a liquid at room temperatures, which is unusual for metal. So again, that idea of Mercury being like outside of normal categories or breaking the rules. All right, so some keywords for Mercury. We have both, either, neither. Mercury is variable, mutable, adaptable, often youthful, swift, clever, intellectual. Again, this is like more of like intellect in the sense of like cleverness and IQ and ability to like solve problems and analyze and all that sort of thing. Educated, versatile, elusive, fickle, distracted, ambiguous, ambivalent, multiple, and I said non-binary, creator of binaries. Although Mercury is non-binary, Mercury doesn't symbolize like being sort of everything all at once. That's more Jupiterian. So although Mercury is non-binary, Mercury divides things into binaries. And sometimes I like to think of Mercury as like the boundary line itself, which is neither on one side nor the other, but the thing that like separates one side from the other. So Mercury both rules boundaries, but is also able to cross boundaries. Articulation, I think, is a really nice word for Mercury. It refers both to speech as well as like a thing, an object that is articulated. It has like a joint or like a separation where the parts of the thing can be like moved relative to each other. So the idea of like breaking things down into pieces is very mercurial. Other things like communication, connection, and here like not so much interpersonal connection, but like connection of ideas to each other. Mercury rules like translation, speech, language, symbol. Now we have the word hermeneutics, which is the kind of art or science of like textual interpretation, and literally has the name Hermes right in the word. Also things like number and like computation or calculation, all very mercurial. Manipulating information and data is very mercurial. Also things like thought, discursive reason, critical thinking, dialectic. And again, dialectic is about like two things being related or opposed to each other, very mercurial. Also doubt, skepticism, analysis, deconstruction, dismantling things, looking at how things are made, taking them apart, understanding the mechanics of things. Also dispute and argument. Mercury is a storyteller, one who sort of weaves narratives, either true or false narratives. So the Mercury is the producer of meaning and intelligibility. Mercury is a traveler, a wanderer, a messenger, a mediator, something that goes between two things or mediates between things. The transmitter. Mercury can also be a sophist who sort of uses rhetoric and cleverness to mislead, or takes, intentionally takes like false positions. So there's some of this sort of ambivalence about Mercury. Mercury is both like information and processing information and speech and communication, but also lying and misleading and deceiving. Mercury has this kind of ambiguity. Devil's advocate is a great thing for Mercury, like intentionally taking the opposite position just for the sake of taking the oppositional position is a very like mercurial thing to do. And like I said, Mercury can be a liar or a thief, and Mercury is the silver-tongued trickster. Mercury also rules the marketplace and commerce, computers, the internet, engineering. In America, we often see the caduceus symbol being used for hospitals and medicine. That's actually a confusion. It really should be the staff of Asclepios, the god of healing. Though, well, won't get into it too much, but I think it's interesting to think about the fact that in the United States, we have put the emblem of the god of commerce on our medical buildings. Yeah. I'll just leave that at that. All right, and I think Mercury, also rules, Qabalah, astrology, alchemy, magic, and spells are interesting, right? Like a spell is literally like is related to the word like spelling, similar to the way that the word grimoire is actually etymologically, from grammar. A grimoire is like a magical grammar, or like the information about the magical language. Oh yeah, Constanter, that's a really interesting thing. I actually did a bunch of research about this image, trying to find other stuff about why Virgo was being pictured as a mermaid, and I couldn't find anything. I'm really curious about that too. So yeah, excellent question. I don't know the answer. And even some of the symbolism of Virgo actually seems to be to be almost like the opposite of a lot of like traditional meanings of mermaids. About being kind of like enticing and sexual and sort of like luring sailors to their doom and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't really seem to fit like Virgo very well. So yeah, I'm really curious about that too. Yeah, good eyes there. All right, next Venus. And yeah, apologies, we will go over. That seems to become a theme in my classes. If you need to take off, no worries, but we'll just get through the planets here as quickly as I can. All right, so Venus, the Greek name was Phosphoros, meaning light bringer. Venus's appearance to the naked eye is a brilliant white star, seen in the east. When she's a morning star, she's seen in the east before dawn, or in the west after sunset when she's an evening star. And she's the brightest non-luminary in the sky. She's brighter than all the other planets and brighter than any of the fixed stars. Now, I was going to include images of what the planets look like, from Earth, but photographs just don't do it any kind of justice. Photographs of Venus just look like a little white dot, in the middle of like a black background. But I really encourage you, to try to like observe the planets and really appreciate like the quality of the light. There's no way that photographs can do it justice, but the sort of the brilliant, luminous, like really, really beautiful quality of Venus's light is really significant, and I think helps to give a nice intuitive sense of why she signifies what she does. Her retrograde cycle traces like a really harmonious image. It's an image like traces a pentagram over the course of 8 years, and we may come back to that idea later. I'll explain how that happens. But yeah, her retrograde cycle traces this image of harmony and balance and everything, which is really nice. And like we said, she's never more than 47 degrees from the sun because her orbit is inside of ours. All right, then we have the god, the goddess Aphrodite, or Venus, in the Roman tradition. Goddess of love and beauty, also of sexuality, right? All of that is very connected to Venus. You can see her there on the right. That statue, that's a perfume bottle there, and Venus rules perfumes, and I think that should be fairly obvious. And on the left we have an image I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Interestingly, Botticelli was an associate of Marsilio Ficino, the important, Platonist, magician, astrologer, hermeticist from the Renaissance. And so it's thought that this image, as well as some of Botticelli's other images, may have actually had like a talismanic intent and function. And Venus was very important for that circle. The idea of beauty for them was really connected to like Platonic ideas of beauty, and the idea that beauty is one of the key things that leads our soul into the higher worlds. So there's that Renaissance focus on beauty is definitely coming out of the Platonic tradition, and beauty has this incredibly important like spiritual function for them. And so I think it's really nice to think of that stuff related to Venus, of beauty not just being some sort of shallow thing, but of actually this incredibly like deep and significant thing that leads our souls, to the higher realms. All right, so astrological significations of Venus. As we talked about, she's the benefic of the night, or the lesser benefic. Her glyph is a mirror, which you can think of both, as like related to beauty, as well as the idea of like reflecting, that the higher Platonic realms in like individual, beautiful, like persons or art objects or natural, phenomena or whatever in the world. Her metal is copper. Traditionally, Venus often is said to rule over all precious metals, but giving like specific metals to specific planets, we generally give copper to Venus, sometimes brass, but generally copper. Her temperament is mildly phlegmatic, so cool and moist, but there's some traditions that say that she becomes warm, and so when she's a morning star, so she would be warm and moist as a morning star. So interesting thing to consider. Venus is beautiful, pleasant, clean, aromatic, sweet, sympathetic. She rules relationships, friendships, love in all forms, both romantic as well as friendships, even the love of like, a parent to a child or family members, all of that, love of any form, even the love of like abstract ideas or art objects, and that's all Venus. Sexuality, affection, merriment, laughter, kindness, and favors are all Venusian. She rules pleasure, enjoyment, desire, attraction, both the things that you're you can talk about Venus in someone's chart is indicating both things that you're attracted to, as well as the ways that you like attract other people. Taste, aesthetics, preferences, and harmonious proportion. Again, that classical idea of beauty as like harmonious proportion. Venus can signify harmony, fairness, justice, diplomacy, exchange, and trade. Venus rules the refined arts, like what we call like the high arts, as well as crafts, and is often associated with music and with singing. Venus rules luxury, value, precious stones, jewelry, ornamentation. On the more negative or difficult side, Venus could be superficial or indulgent or indolent or even a bit like dilettantish. And interesting, now this is maybe like a go-to signification for Venus, but among this audience, it might be significant that Venus is also said to rule ritual and ceremony. So where Mercury is like the magician, Venus, the ritual and ceremony and all that is Venusian, which is an interesting thing to think about. All right, now we have Mars, the red planet here. So Greek name, something like Piraeus, meaning the fiery one. Appearance to the naked eye as a red star. Very distinctive in the sky. That red color is caused by dust in the atmosphere, which is actually rusting iron. And as we'll see, iron is the metal of Mars. And the synodic cycle of Mars traces a really kind of jagged and erratic pattern around the zodiac, which is very appropriate to Mars. All right, so now we have the figures, the Greek Ares or the Roman Mars, both war gods. Although somewhat different, the Greek Aries is a much less pleasant figure. Aries can be really brutal and selfish. He's also kind of a coward. He's not honorable at all. Although he is, the lover of Aphrodite, which is a very interesting thing. The Roman Mars is a bit more civilized and is often depicted more as like a general, whereas Aries is more the kind of brutal warrior, and Athena was like strategy and like military strategy. The Roman Mars is a little bit closer to that idea of like strategy, and is often depicted as a general. And in a lot of ways, Mars was almost like the patron of the Roman Empire, which was, for a while, extremely successful in military terms, right? All right, so we have Mars here. Mars is the malefic of the night, or the lesser malefic. His glyph is essentially a stylized version of a spear. And Aries and Mars were always depicted, or almost always depicted, carrying spears. And his metal is iron. And again, we think about iron and its use of weapons and other tools and things, right? So Mars's temperament is extreme. He's extremely choleric, so he's very hot and very dry. And so some words for Mars are like scorching, sharp, pungent, irascible, inflammatory, abrupt, bold, reckless, vigorous, and unsubmitting. Right. So although, a lot of these things are kind of difficult, I want to bring out, why Mars is actually very helpful. And it can be important to have, a deficiency of Mars is not a good thing. Right. Mars can symbolize friction, both, sort of difficult friction, as well as the way that sometimes in interpersonal relationships, a certain type of friction can actually lead to whether it's sexual or not, to relationships, right? So there's a certain kind of friction that can actually be very beneficial in human relationships. Also, antagonism, strife, conflict, aggression. Mars rules dynamic force, energy and impulse. Also, courage, heroism, and ambition. And so again, that idea of being unsubmitting, Mars is fighting regardless of what you're fighting against, right? It could be fighting against other people, but it could also be, fighting for your ideals, or, like Mars could fight wars, but he could also fight against wars. There's like an old punk slogan, like fight war, not wars. That sort of fighting, even if you're fighting to end wars or to end oppression, that's still martial. Even if it isn't literal fighting, Mars still rules all of that. Anything you're fighting for or striving for, or fighting, anytime you're opposing something, that's like a martial thing. And so, it all depends on what you're fighting for or what you're fighting against, right? Mars also rules drive, and we can think of that as drive in the general sense, as well as the sex drive. Mars definitely has a sexual significance, and Mars and Venus together obviously have that sexual chemistry, right? Like Aphrodite and Aries. All right, Mars can attack, defend, struggle, compete, strive, assert, and rupture. And Mars rules separation, aversion, and cutting. Mars rules strenuous labor, athletics, war, martial arts, surgery, right? Because surgery is like cutting into the body or cutting things away from the body. Crime, anger, hunting, and violence. So again, there's both healthier and unhealthier versions of this expression. Mars also rules the heat of the forge and transformation and trial by fire. So that the kind of alchemical heat, or like heating thing, alchemical processes where things are burned or like reduced to ashes or like melted down. You need a martial heat in order for any of those things to happen, for transformation to happen. All right, and then we have got Jupiter. We're at an hour and a half, but we've just 2 planets left, and then one brief thing, and then we'll be done. All right, so Jupiter in Greek was called something like Phaethon, the radiant one. His appearance to the naked eye is a bright white star, not quite as bright as Venus, but similar in quality. And in that, the benefics have that pure white shining quality, whereas Mars is red, and as we'll see, Saturn is a kind of dull yellow color. So that's that observational distinction is part of that as well. All right, Jupiter is the largest planet other than the Sun, and the mass of Jupiter is 2.5 times that of all other like non-solar objects in our system combined together. So the Sun is 99.8% of the mass in our solar system. Jupiter is most of that 0.2. Right, and then Jupiter we're not going to get into it here, but Jupiter was really, really influential in shaping the early solar system, and also helped to bring water to the early Earth by like hurling stuff from a little bit further out to Earth, and also protects the Earth from comets. His huge gravitational field helps to divert comets away from the Earth. Though his gravitational field does also sometimes send like asteroids into the inner system, which sometimes collide with Earth. Jupiter has more than 79 moons, and 4 of these, the so-called Galilean moons, because Galileo Galilei discovered them with his telescope. We have Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. They all have planet-like features. And actually, in the photo on the right, you can actually see Ganymede emerging out just from behind Jupiter there. And so Jupiter is almost the center of his own planetary system, and has these 4, like planet-like moons orbiting around him. And Ganymede is actually larger than the planet Mercury. And that all fits, I think, quite nicely with the symbolism of Zeus or the Roman Jupiter. He was, king of the gods, father of the gods. You can see him there in the middle image and on the left, depicted, with his thunderbolt that he hurls. And it's interesting, Jupiter and Zeus can be compared to like the Indian god Indra, who wields the Vajra. And then the Indian tradition really builds up a lot of that symbolism of the Vajra. And it's interesting to bring some of that symbolism into the idea of Jupiter's thunderbolt, if you're familiar with those traditions. On the right there, Jupiter is sitting next to an eagle, right? Jupiter is often associated with eagles, the king of the birds and the most noble of the birds in that traditional symbolism. And then holding in his other hand there, that's the goddess Victoria, right? He's symbolizing victory. Again, and if you look at like a family, another important thing, Jupiter has so many lovers, and if you look at like the family trees of the Greek and Roman gods, you'll see that so many of the gods are the children of Zeus. So again, that idea of productivity and fertility and expansion and vastness is all very, very Jupiterian. He is a bit over the top. Over the top is a good word for Jupiter. All right, so here we have Jupiter is the benefic of the day, or the greater benefic. His glyph is actually just a kind of stylized version of the Z or Zeta for Zeus. And his metal, in our tradition, we usually say his metal is tin. Historically, there's sometimes others, but yeah, we associate Jupiter with the metal tin. His temperament is mildly sanguine, so warm and moist, fertile and social and gregarious is all associated with the sanguine temperament. So Jupiter is wise, optimistic, abundant, fertile, enthusiastic, exuberant, magnanimous, generous, affable, permissive. Jupiter can be stabilizing, incorporating, comprehending, unifying, uplifting, educating, improving, and providing opportunities. Jupiter can signify liberty, freedom, peace, honor, mercy, and love. And I really like to associate Jupiter with like the sky by day, that sort of vast, blue, clear sky. I think that's all very Jupiterian. And if you remember anything like the kind of Tibetan symbolism, like connecting the blue sky as like an image of the Rigpa, the sort of primordial clarity of things, I think that's actually a nice thing to connect to Jupiter. Also, the heights, ascension, elevation, a kind of broad, holistic, total vision is very Jupiterian, and the ideas of like social and environmental benefit are very Jupiterian. Expansion, growth, success, profit, fortune. There should be a comma after fortune there. Fortune, comma, coherence, increase, inflation, but also, as Kelly was just pointing out here, things like excess, extravagance, or prodigality are also Jupiterian. And points to where that Jupiter can sometimes bring difficulties as well. Things like excess and extravagance could be problematic, in a life. Jupiter can also signify authority, governance, but also superiority, pride, or arrogance as well, if he's in a more difficult position. Jupiter is often associated with priests or priestesses, those sacred offices, and with temples and the sacred, and wisdom, and with gnosis. You can really contrast like mercurial knowledge with Jupiterian gnosis, which resists the ability to be captured in like dualistic language, which is Mercury is all about that dualistic language, whereas Jupiter is something beyond that, something more total and expansive and kind of holistic. All right, last one here, Saturn. The Greek name was the Phaenon, the shining one. And to the naked eye, Saturn appears as a dull, kind of yellow-brown star. I usually think of Saturn as being kind of a dull yellow. I know others have talked about Saturn as brown. Saturn is the most distant visible planet, visible to the naked eye. And from Saturn, the sun would be, you wouldn't really get much. The Saturn doesn't receive much energy from the sun because of his distance. So the sun would actually be 100 times dimmer from Saturn than it is from Earth. So Saturn is at the edges, kind of almost like exiled from the solar light, and is more distant and cold, and rules the boundaries and peripheries. Saturn is the slowest planet, and he also deviates least from the ecliptic, which is appropriate to his symbolism. The interior of Saturn is very alien and mysterious, and it is still being investigated by astronomers. It's all kinds of weird things happen inside of Saturn too, like it rains liquid helium. Yeah, the astronomy of Saturn is very interesting. And Saturn's rings, of course, the real distinctive feature of Saturn. Are made of ice, and there's a theory that it may actually be the remnants of a moon that Saturn pulled apart with his orbit, which is very appropriate because the Greek Cronus swallowed his own children, right? So there we see Rubens' depiction of Saturn devouring his son, right? As the Greek god Cronus, produced children. He was sort of jealous and paranoid that they would overthrow him, and he swallowed them until eventually, Zeus isn't swallowed, and eventually does overthrow him and frees the gods that Cronus has swallowed. So here we're actually talking about 3 separate gods, which is a little bit complex, but it's important for his symbolism. So we have the Titan Cronus. As well as in the Greek tradition, there's the personification of time as Chronos, and already because of the similarities of the words and the similarities of the symbolism, these are already associated together. So yeah, Cronus and Chronos, time, come associated together. Now, in the Roman tradition, the Roman Saturn actually is later associated with the Greek Cronus, but it's actually a separate god, and a less kind of frightening one as well. Saturn, rules over agriculture, and yeah, is more of a benefic figure. He was said to have ruled over the early Golden Age. When Saturn was ruling the world, everything was a golden age, and the Romans really celebrated Saturn. The big celebration around after the winter solstice, after the harvest is over, was the Saturnalia, which is a time of feasting and merriment, and that kind of carnival-esque reversal of normal social positions or relaxing of social rules was all part of the Saturnalia. And there in that fresco on the right, you can see him depicted with a scythe, as we see in the other images there too, with a scythe or a sickle, I guess, actually. And he's wearing a winter shroud in that image of the right, that associated with the winter and with the cold. So Saturn is a complex and difficult planet to understand. And we can see some of that in the image there, the child there, that's the image, that idea of Cronus or devouring his children there is in that image. We can also see in this image too, Saturn is lame. One of his feet is his foot is wounded there, and that sort of lameness or the woundedness of Saturn is part of the planet's traditional symbolism. So Saturn is the malefic of the day, or the greater malefic, and his glyph there is actually. Now, in this one, this kind of stylized, and there's that little curl at the end, but this is originally the image of a sickle or a scythe. And we can associate that both with harvest and agriculture, as well as, that idea of the Grim Reaper is a modified Saturnian symbol, right, of harvesting and ending life. Saturn's metal is lead, which is dark and heavy and actually toxic. His temperament is extremely melancholic, so very cold and very dry. And he is slow, heavy, dark, humble, strict, enduring, patient, sober, pessimistic, gloomy, austere, ascetic, secretive, and cautious. He rules structure, foundations, building, order, discipline, law, rules, restraint, control, responsibilities, burdens, and rigidity. He signifies toil, hardship, loss, deprivation, defects, decline, and delay. Oftentimes, Saturn, places in the life that are connected to Saturn, like in a chart, it does not necessarily that those things will never happen or never work out well, but they may just be delayed. Like if Saturn is connected to places associated with like the bearing of children or something like that, it may mean, that infertility, but it could also mean choosing not to have children, or it could also mean just like having children later in life. All of those things are possible Saturnian significations. Let's see, where was I? Okay, right, so Saturn rules agriculture, harvest, and like the fruits of action or consequences. And we could link that to ideas about like the laws of karma. Those are all kind of Saturnian things. And they're things that sort of bind us and determine things, right? They're sort of opposed to like kind of without Saturn, you'd have a sort of absolute sort of freedom without like structure or boundaries. That wouldn't work well. You really need Saturn, and you need those kind of like laws and rules, even if we're just talking about natural laws and rules and not like human laws and rules. All right, so Saturn can signify time, like time itself, as well as the past and tradition and age or old age, death, mortality, finitude, and limits are all signified by Saturn. And all those are important. Without the limits imposed by our eventual death, human life would have no shape, and there'd be no real reason to do things, right? Our eventual mortality sort of gives shape and even meaning to life in a lot of ways, right? Even though it itself is something that, is sort of scary or frightening. Let's see. So Saturn can indicate things like depression, anxiety, worries, or guilt. And if you struggle with Saturn, or if you struggle with those things, you might look at Saturn and your Saturnian placement for those things. Saturn, that melancholic temperament, melancholy, although the melancholic temperament signifies a lot more than melancholy, or what we now call depression. They are associated with each other. And so that's something you might think about if you do, suffer from, like me, suffer from depression or any of those sorts of issues. Though again, there's no reason to be like fearful or anything like that about this sort of stuff. It's just if those things are part of your life, Saturn might be a place to look, and figuring out how to better work with Saturn. All right, Saturn also signifies things like discrimination, just discrimination in the neutral sense of like making a difference between one thing and another, not the more negative sense of that necessarily. Also, things like judgment, exclusion, denial, negation, and binding. But also concentration, meditation, quiet observation, stillness, solitude. Those are all very Saturnian things too. Going on a meditation retreat is like an extremely Saturnian thing to do. You're sort of bound and restricted, and you're just sitting there like with your own sort of weird, thoughts and anxieties and all that. You're not talking to other people, and you're being still and quiet. That's a very like Saturnian sort of thing, but not at all negative, of course. Saturn can also signify the acceptance of reality, as well as the wisdom of long experience. And so we can contrast that with like the Jupiterian gnosis as well. The wisdom of Saturn is like the wisdom, that older people, like tend to have. And if we say that someone is sort of wise beyond their years, or someone is like an old soul, that's kind of like a strong Saturn or something like that. And it's the wisdom of experience, and the wisdom that comes from, from experiencing loss and hardship, and, both gains and losses and all that sort of stuff. The wisdom that comes from that is Saturnian wisdom. And of course, awareness of mortality and all that sort of stuff is so necessary to spiritual development, right? Without an awareness of our eventual end, there would be little need for spiritual practice. And religious traditions and things like that probably wouldn't have developed without that awareness of mortality. I was going to talk about the lunar nodes, but we're already 15 minutes over. So I'm just going to skip that, and we'll talk about the lunar nodes at the beginning of our next class. All right, so just right quick, before we wrap up, suggested practices for the next 2 weeks. Continue with your practice of the lesser ritual of the hexagram that we learned 2 weeks ago. Again, that's really going to be the foundation for what we'll do next week and in some of the weeks following. Or next class, sorry, I keep saying next week. Next class in 2 weeks, as well as some of the weeks following. I'm also suggesting that you take some time to meditate on the symbolism, the archetypes, the mythology, the astrological significations of these planets. And really thinking about them as a map of like the human psyche, as well as our reality. reality and the world and social life and relationships and all that sort of stuff. So just meditating on that stuff, and then as you're able, connecting that to to Qabalah or tarot or other symbol systems that you have. And I'm also suggesting that you maybe spend some time directing your attention to, what did I write here? Direct your attention to the planets, manifest both within and without, in your life. So pay attention to the signatures of the planets in your daily life and within your own body, mind. And you can practice attributing events, ideas, objects, images, plants, animals, literary characters, other people or other phenomena you encounter to the 7 classical planets. And so starting to build them up as a language. As a language and as a way that once you start working with astrology, in a more practical way, it's really helpful to be able to identify those signatures in a life and go, that's your Saturn. I see it. That's your, Saturn and Libra in the 6th house or whatever. I can identify it there. A lot of that is just learning the language of these things and learning them as a symbol set. Kelly, I'll post them. Well, so I'll post them on the forum for members. On the general discussion forum, I'll put a link to the slides as well as to the YouTube video that'll go up in a couple of days. For non-members, feel free to email me. You can email either my personal email address if you have it, or at provost@tots.org, which is easier to remember than how to spell my last name. I can give you a link to the Google Slide Drive. But yeah, for members, just look for the link on the general discussion forum to go up in the next couple of days. You won't get a notification because I just edit that one post there. So I'll just edit the post and you'll see the link there. Email me if you have any trouble with that. But yeah. For more about the work of Temple of Silver Star, you can visit tots.org/FAQ. And for anyone who's not a member of the academic or the initiatory track, we do have a $5 suggested donation. And if you'd like to send that, you can send it via PayPal to payments@tots.org. All right, so thanks very much, everybody. And like I said, we'll do the lunar nodes at the beginning of our class next time, and then we'll get into to planetary hexagram rituals and some other things connected with that. So for anybody watching on YouTube, thanks very much. You can subscribe to our channel to get updates when new videos are posted. Thanks. 93.